Hello, 8th and ninth grade students. So I wanted to just make this video really quickly for you to remind you what we've worked on with regard to skills, which include the skills both of writing and reading critically, but also the skills of identifying elements of poetry. Um, so I'll review all those things in different sections. I suppose I should have made an outline for this video. Now I'm nervous. Okay, so since we will probably not be meeting face to face for the duration of the school year and the Saturdays, I want to give you the option if you want writing help. So a lot of us were working on essay structure and really perfecting that. And some of us who have really gotten down the structure and the organization well, we're kind of looking towards pushing beyond that sort of elementary structure and experimenting with other forms. So I want to offer to you, if you want to continue working on that, you absolutely can. This is not a strict assignment. You do not have to write an essay. We are in the middle of a pandemic, so I'm giving you enrichment work if you choose to do it. Ms. Tracy will also send you some other suggestions. I'm going to give you some ideas around journaling. This is a really, it's a scary time. It's also a unique time. I don't think anybody living right now has really seen anything like this, and certainly we've never seen a pandemic like this when the world was so connected. And so it will be really valuable to your lives and to the future, I think, for you to record your experiences during this time, if that's something that's helpful to you. I'm also going to send you some coping strategies and a list of things to do for maintaining mental health and emotional health, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, I know I'm your English teacher, but literature is very much about mental and emotional health. Okay, so I wanted to review and read with you one last time all the poems that we went over. I'm going to link the poems down below as well, so if you have access to the internet, I guess if you don't have access to the internet, you're probably not seeing this video anyway, but you'll have access to the links. I couldn't find the cat or the book that I have that has the poem The Cat by Galway Kinnell. It must be in a box somewhere, but I do have a couple of the poems in the book form, so that's kind of exciting because Charles Simic's poem, the Untitled poem From the World Doesn't End, it looks nothing like the way it's presented online, so it's kind of cool to see the way the author originally published it as opposed to how it's presented in an online format, because that format always changes or can change, even things like line breaks. So Charles Simic, his collection is a collection of prose poems, and it's interesting to see where he breaks the line or doesn't break the line versus where poetry.org or whoever published it broke the line. Okay, so sorry, I'm just taking that down. So let's go ahead and read these poems, which is exciting. And then I have, you probably can't see this, but I have this amazing, on my cracked screen, which no, I never got fixed for all the folks who were advising me where to go. All your ideas about what the themes of the poem were and what the message was, which is an if you choose to write, if you choose to work on your writing during this time, there's so many different suggestions I have for doing so, but if you choose to write an academic essay about any of these poems, or even a mixed genre essay that includes some personal element along with some critical work and analysis of the poems, that the option of choosing a poem focusing on the message or theme, and then analyzing and explaining why that's the message of the theme, specifically through the elements of imagery, which is what we were looking at, and of course, metaphor and simile. But specifically, we're really focusing on imagery and how we analyze imagery and how our critical thinking skills and our ability to analyze and interpret leads to a deeper understanding of work. So that's the thinking skill we were working on. the poetry element we were working on was imagery, and also the turn of the poem, or the volta, as fancy poets call it. That's what we call it in a sonnet, the volta. The turn, where, I forget who said it, but one of you said where everything changes, or I don't know, you had like a beautiful description of what a turn is. So we're looking at poetry, we're unlocking the poems by looking for those things. So if you wanted to write a traditional academic essay on this, and you wanted some feedback on that to work on your structure and format and writing skills academically, which is going to be super useful to you in high school when schools reopen, then feel free to follow that format of choosing a poem and choosing a message, and then explaining where you see that message and why, specifically through imagery, and how does the turn of the poem support that message, or maybe the turn of the poem reveals it, right? Okay, so let's get to reading. What shall we read first? The cat? Your favorite? The one that eludes all clear answers. I still don't know what this poem is about, although you had some brilliant analysis of it. All right, The Cat by Galway Kinnell. I think this poem might be from his book, When One Has Lived a Long Time Alone, but I could be wrong. That's the book I have, and I think I read it in the book, but I don't know. And it doesn't have an attribution. Oh, it does have an attribution. Yes, it's from that poem, that book of poetry. All right, The Cat by Galway Kinnell. The Cat. The first thing that happened was that somebody borrowed the Jeep, drove 50 feet, went off the road. The cat may have stuck a tire iron or baseball bat into the steering wheel. I don't know if it did or if it didn't. I do know, I don't say it out loud. When the cat is around, something goes wrong. Why doesn't our host forewarn us? Well, he tries. He gives each guest on arrival a list of instructions about the cat. I never was able to read mine, for the cat was watching when I got it, so I stuck it in my pocket to read later. But the cat saw me, leapt at me, nearly knocked me down, clawed at the pocket, would have ripped my clothes off if I had not handed it over. The guest book contains the name of the young woman who was my friend, who brought me here in the first place, who is the reason I have come back, to find out what became of her. But no one would tell me anything. Except tonight, my final evening at dinner, the host says, there is someone, a woman in your life. I know he means her, but why the present tense? Whom you have in, the next word sounds like blurrery, but it could be slavery. Well, yes, I say. Yes, but where's the cat? It is an awful thing you are doing, he goes on. Quite awful. But who? I protest. What are you talking about? The cat, he says. When you lock her up, she becomes dangerous. The cat? What cat? I remember the kitten I saved out of the burlap sack when I was 7. I was fathering or mothering her. My father or mother said, stop smothering it. Listen to the sonics, the sounds in those two lines. Suddenly, an electric force grabs my feet. I see it has seized the host, too. He is standing up. His hands are flopping at the sides. What is it? I whisper. I'm washing the dishes, he says. Oh, my God, I think. I'm washing the dishes, he repeats. I realize he's trying to get the cat to believe he is not in a seizure, but washing the dishes. If either of us lets on about the seizure, I know for certain the cat will kill us both. All right. Next, let's save Billy Collins for last, since he's a possible entry into analyzing these poems. All right, Nayyirah Waheed, an untitled poem from her book, Salt. My whole life I have ate my tongue, ate my tongue, ate my tongue. I am so full of my tongue, you would think speaking is easy, but it is not, for we who keep our lives in our mouths. All right, remember we talked about for that one the very intentional breaking of rules, of grammatical rules, right? And what that communicates to the audience, to the reader. Let's see, we have next let's read Ways of Rebelling by Nathalie Handal. Another prose poem, and particularly interesting poem to try to interpret. Again, you all had some amazing ideas. Some of the ideas was perhaps this is a poem that is suspicious of nationalism. Perhaps this is a poem that is trying of a person who's been displaced, who is in a different country than her birth country or her parents' country or her country of cultural heritage. And what does that mean? You know, particularly if this is written the way we think about what nation she is speaking of or what country she is speaking of, I think can also change the meaning a lot. So, and none of us really, I don't have an answer for who she's speaking to or about. So we should probably look that up. I believe this author lives in the United States now, but I'm not sure. So look that up. Okay, Ways of Rebelling by Nathalie Handal. Who needs to be at peace in the world? It helps to be between wars, to die a few times each day, to understand your father's sky, as you take it apart piece by piece and can't feel anything. Can't feel the tree growing under your feet, the eyes poking night only to find another night to compare it to. Who ever heard of turning pain into hummingbirds or redbirds? Haven't we grown? What does it mean to be older? Maybe a house without doors can still survive a storm. Maybe I can't find the proper way to rebel or dim it. I can't leave. I want to, but you grow inside me. And as I watch you, before I know it, I'm too heavy, too full of you to move. Maybe that's what they meant when they said you shouldn't love a country too much. All right, that last image, oh yeah, I forgot. You guys had so many interesting ideas. The last image, some people had said maybe it is about addiction, whether that's an addiction to a substance or the substance of patriotism or nationalism. This idea of becoming saturated with something so you're rooted to the ground. And then we also talked about the imagery of pregnancy, something growing inside of something else, of a person. And how Dick Gregory, in his essay Shame that we read the opening of, how he says, I was pregnant with poverty. And so the idea of pregnancy is gestation, right? Like a thing slowly growing, incrementally growing within a uterus. So I always think that it's so interesting that the word uterus reminds me of the word universe. But that's a different point. Okay, so this idea that whatever it is that is plaguing the speaker and Nathalie Handal's poem, and it's called Ways of Rebelling, right? So how do you rebel against something that's growing within you? Is that the rebellion, right? There's so many questions I have about this poem, and every single time I read it, I discover a new line I hadn't noticed the first time. The poem is, I think, very deceptive in that it has these kind of sparkling and shocking lines like, whoever heard of turning pain into hummingbirds or redbirds? Oh my gosh, that line is so sharp, right? But there's these other lines that I don't notice at first, and then I do. Eyes poking night only to find another night to compare to it to. So the idea of eyes poking is strange, but night, compare, those are all sort of everyday words, right? But when you string them all together, it creates this very confusing image that is hard to visualize because I don't know how eyes poke, you know? And so I would encourage you to read this poem several more times, and I think if you want to challenge, I mean, the cat is challenging in its own way because what is Galway Kinnell talking about? But it's a story. It's a little bit more narrative. This poem is what we would call a lyric poem in that it's very, it's inside the writer's head, and the speaker, we don't have full access to the speaker. We don't have a narrative arc. We don't have a plot, right? We have reflection and introspection and thinking. And so I think this poem is a great opportunity for a challenge to analyze. All right, what is next? So we've done Galway, Nathalie, Nayyirah, Waheed. Let us do Charles Simic, then Kaveh, Akbar, and then we'll go back to Billy Collins to wrap up, to then use Billy Collins as a key to open all of these poems. All right, Charles Simic. This book is so well loved, as you can see. It has no cover. Oh, no, that's the back. You're lucky, it does have a cover. I love the cover of this. It's really gross, sorry. I mean, the book itself is like dirty. It has coffee stains on it, I think. But look at that cover. I would love for you to analyze the cover too. All right. This is called, oh yeah, and also just the title. The title is a very timely title for a time like this. A poignant title, an important title. The World Doesn't End. Poignant means relevant, sharp, full of meaning. You could say the word poignant means something is pregnant with meaning. Okay, so this, I'm excited to show you how this looks in the book as opposed to how it looked online. Remember, online it was kind of thinner and longer, but look what Simic does with these lines. You'll see that every line is indented, and then if you ever learn APA format, this is how APA format, oh no, this is the opposite of how APA format is. Strike that. I don't know how to edit videos, so I'm not going to edit that out, but just ignore I just said that. Anyway, it's interesting because everything's indented, and then the second part of a line, because it's a prose poem, if the line goes to the end, it's not as much of, it seems like it's not so much a line break as it just goes on to the next line, but it's not indented. So you'll notice here. See what I'm talking about? Okay, and see how that looks different than, I haven't actually analyzed how different it is or where the lines break, and I could be totally wrong, but visually it looks very different to me. Okay, Untitled, Charles Simic, from The World Doesn't End. My mother was a braid of black smoke. She bore me swaddled over the burning cities. The sky was a vast and windy place for a child to play. We met many others who were like us, just like us. They were trying to put on their overcoats with arms made of smoke. The high heavens were full of little shrunken deaf ears instead of stars. It's one of my favorite poems of my life so far. I don't remember when I first encountered Charles Simic, but he's influenced everything I write. But even before he influenced my writing, he influenced the way I saw the world. And he is a great example of an artist, of a writer who has lived through many possible endings and traumas and tragedies and survived. And so he might be a place to look, a person to look to for comfort, that book in particular. Okay. I don't actually know that I would totally recommend that book to 8th and 9th graders, but there are some great pieces in it. So maybe hold off on buying the whole thing till you're a little older. All right. So from Calling a Wolf a Wolf by Kaveh Akbar. Orchids are sprouting from the floorboards. Okay, so this is a great poem for really looking at the turn or the volta of a poem. And what I find fascinating, and I've not seen any writing on this as it pertains to this poem or in general, but so I don't know if there's a word for this in poetry, but what Akbar does in this poem is he gives us an image. We hold on to that image in our minds, right? And they're very concrete images. Remember we talked about the difference between an abstract noun and a concrete noun? And an abstract noun is an idea or an emotion. It's something we can't really touch. So the word love is used by everyone, everywhere, but it is an emotion. The feeling of love, which is a thing, it's an emotion, is not, it'll be as different as there are people in the world. So because it's abstract, we all understand it to be a thing that we experience or that is real, but we all have a different definition of it, right? But A concrete noun is a computer. My hand, this little stool the computer's sitting on, the couch, right? These are things we can touch and feel and experience. They're in our very physical world, right? So Kaveh, Akbar gives us these images that are concrete. They're rooted in our physical world. And then he changes the image mid-line. And so you have this amazing and startling and kind of devastating and also beautiful turn at the end of the poem. But each line has its own turn, which I think is dazzling and fascinating, the way that he does this. Well, I'll read it through and then I'll point out a couple lines that do what I'm talking about. Orchids are sprouting from the floorboards. Orchids are sprouting from the floorboards. Orchids are gushing from the faucets. The cat mews orchids from his mouth. His whiskers are orchids. The grass is sprouting orchids. It is becoming mostly orchids. The trees are filled with orchids. The tire swing is twirling with orchids. The sunlight on the wet cement is a white orchid. The car's tires leave a trail of orchids. A bouquet of orchids lifts from its tailpipe. Teenagers are texting each other pictures of orchids on their phones, which are also orchids. Old men in orchid penny loafers furiously trade orchids. Mothers fill bottles with warm orchids to feed their infants, who are orchids themselves. Their coos are a kind of orchid. The clouds are all orchid. They are raining orchids. The walls are all orchids. The teapot is an orchid. The blank easel is an orchid. And this cold is an orchid. Oh, Lydia, we miss you terribly. This poem. So a couple lines where our concrete image changes into an orchid, and so the turn happens within the line itself. I don't know that other poets would call it a turn, to be clear, but this idea of twisting reality is very much alive in this poem. And I think that's the art of this poem. That's the skill of this poem, that on within, a line of 5 words, one image turns into another image as if it's magic. Almost like Kaveh Akbar is taking words and they're like a long balloon, and by the end of the line he's twisted this thing that we know to be a balloon into a totally other shape, into the appearance of a dog, or I don't know what people make from balloons, another balloon animal. Okay, so one of the lines: the trees are filled with orchids. The tire swing is twirling with orchids. The sunlight on the wet cement is a white orchid. So those are not so startling, right? The trees, we see trees and then filled with orchids. So it changes a little bit, but it's not so unusual to see a tree full of flowers in the springtime, right? Tire swing is twirling with orchids, so maybe the orchids are in the tire swing. The sunlight on the wet cement is a white orchid. This would be sort of metaphorical, right? But then we have things like teenagers are texting each other pictures of orchids on their phone, which are also orchids. I see in my head teenagers, a group of teenagers maybe with their phone out texting, right? They're texting pictures of orchids, so I see the picture of orchids going from phone to phone. But then suddenly, as the line is being read, as I am reading the line, the phone in the hands of a teenager turns from a phone into an orchid. That's where the magic is, at that really strange, surreal level, in a line, in a single line. Old men in orchid penny loafers furiously trade orchids. So old men in shoes that are orchids are trading orchids back and forth. And then at the end we get these more, they're still concrete, but they're a little less easy to pin down. So the coos of babies become a kind of orchid, so a sound becomes an orchid. The clouds, right? We can't touch a cloud, but they are physical things we can see. Those are orchids, and they're raining orchids. So we move from teenagers and phones and bottles and the tailpipe of a car to a sound, which is the coo of a baby, to a cloud, which is, accumulated vaporous water, to the cloud breaking. And if the cloud is an orchid, of course the cloud must rain orchids, right? So even though it's surreal, there's rules that are being followed in a way. which I think gives us more entry into the poem. And then, of course, all these orchids, and the last line has nothing to do with an orchid, but rather it is an exclamation of loss and grieving and mourning. Oh, Lydia, we miss you terribly. And many of you had brilliant thoughts about who Lydia is, what that means, how these two ideas relate, how Lydia relates to orchids. Okay, this video is getting quite long and we need to stop soon. So let's go on to Billy Collins. Ow! Oh. And if you are struggling still, although I don't think any of you are struggling with the interpretation of these poems, you've done so great in class and in your homework on it. But if anybody is struggling, or struggling with any future poem, or even to make sense of the world right now, Introduction to Poetry has some suggestions at how we might make sense of things that appear senseless. Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press it an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Okay, I'm going to share with you some thoughts because I just started, before we weren't allowed to have face-to-face class anymore, but I just started the poetry unit with my college students, and they had some really exciting thoughts about some of these images. So a color slide, I barely remember or know what that is. I think it means something with regard to photography. So maybe a photographer could explain that to me. But I think also a projector, like an old school projector in schools, which probably none of you have seen, like I had them in school and I don't remember them, would have a slide that was transparent but also had a color on it so you could see the color. I'm gonna just really explain what the college students explained to me, because I still don't really know what a color slide is. But basically what we realized is if there's something transparent that is made of a color and you hold it up to a light, you are seeing through it whatever's on the other side, but the color is changing whatever's on the other side to that color. But if light is coming through it, it is also projecting color onto you. And so this is this kind of beautiful idea of the exchange that happens between us and a piece of artwork when we either view or read or consume it, right? There's a transaction, there's a conversation, there's this beautiful altering of both ourselves and the art. So you looking through the art changes the world. The art changes the world to reflect something new to you, but also something new is reflected onto you. It's kind of a mystical idea, I think. Okay, and then this is so exciting too. Press an ear against its hive. Okay, I love that image because often we see the image of an ear being held up to a seashell to hear the ocean, right? Which really you're just hearing the sort of the vacancy of all the other sounds, and possibly even sometimes I feel like I can hear the blood rushing in my ear when I do that. So it's not really waves you're hearing. But instead of a seashell here, we have this image of holding our ear up to a hive, right? And what is inside of a hive? If it's a living hive, you have bees, right? Making honey, caring for the worker bees caring for the babies, which probably have a name besides babies. And so it's so much life, right? And so a poem contains so much life. But a student said, also danger. Like, hives are not safe things if you're not wearing a bee suit, right? And so I love the idea that in truth, poetry contains truth, and it is a tool for us to get at the truth in a different way, right? And truth can be very liberating, and it can be scary, and it can be a little dangerous, and it can sting. And so the idea that a poem is a hive with whole worlds within it that are life-giving, but also slightly dangerous. Like there is a little bit of danger in encountering a poem, I think, really makes that image so much fuller for me. I didn't think of any of that until a student shared that. Okay, so to recap, we're looking at imagery. All of those poems contain some really amazing imagery. We are looking at the turn of a poem, really how a poem works on that level of revealing something or showing us something about ourselves or the world. So that's what we're looking at with regard to poetry. But with regard to thinking and writing, we're focusing on the thinking skill of analysis and interpretation. Remember, analysis is to break something down into smaller pieces, look at individual pieces of that. Interpretation is to point to one of those pieces and draw out a meaning from it. We employ that thinking skill in writing when we are writing academic essays. And so with regard to essays and essay structure, you have essay structure. We've gone over it several times. I don't want you to think of the structure as the 5-paragraph essay, because the 5-paragraph essay is a kind of formula that is useful if you need a way to get into an essay, but that's not really where we want to land as writers. We want to move beyond that formulaic structure. But what is beneficial about the idea of it is that you must understand with all writing, even creative writing in a way, and with all argumentation, even verbal arguments, there must be a central point, and then you must support that point, and all of your subpoints must be in service to that central point, right? So if you would like to practice an essay, I would ask you to choose one of those poems, choose the one you like the best, or the one you think is most challenging or easiest, depending on what your goal is, and write to me an essay that's organized and structured, that explains what it's about, really, what it means. It's the poem's sort of premise and message, and then prove that through your analysis of the specific lines of the poem. As far as format goes, you can find, as long as it's organized and everything lines up with and serves that central point, like your spine supporting your neck, and aligning to itself. I need to stop using metaphors for things I don't really understand, like most things in the world. So as long as everything is cohesive and fits together well and is organized, you can find a creative way to answer this question, which means if you open with, it's the 6th day of quarantine and I'm sitting here staring at Billy Collins' Introduction to Poetry, that's fine. When I say academic essay, I think I want to focus on us working on the skills, the thinking skills, and the writing skills of organization, but you are allowed to use first person in this essay if you choose to write the essay. Miss Tracy is going to send you a bunch of other stuff. I'm not really sure how we're going to get work back and forth to each other. I imagine you could email it to Miss Tracy and then she would email it to me. So I guess this is just like a check-in and to share poetry with you that we've already read, but it was really fun for me to go over it again. I think this will probably be far less fun for anyone watching it. And sorry for all the rambly bits and the parts that I don't know how to and do not have the time to edit out. But please be safe, take care of yourselves. This will pass, and we'll all emerge stronger. Love you guys.